Jane sat in the silent kitchen, the faint glow of the ceiling light casting shadows on the oak table. At 48, she still carried a quiet grace. Brown hair falling to her shoulders, deep blue eyes, a slender frame. 5 years ago, her husband died of a stroke, leaving her alone in their suburban Chicago home. She worked at the library, living day by day with books and a nameless loneliness. Emily, her 28-year-old daughter, was a lawyer, consumed by work. She was married to John, 32, a tall architect with green eyes and dark hair. They lived nearby, visiting most weekends. Those evenings warmed the kitchen with laughter and the smell of stew. John brought ease. He cleared the table, fixed the cabinet, chuckled loudly at his own stories. But lately Jane felt something odd. When John hugged her goodbye, his grip lingered, his warmth seeping through her sweater. She caught the woody scent of his cologne, her pulse quickening. Once, as he fixed the cabinet, his gaze slid to her, deep and too long. Jane told herself it was nothing, that he was her son-in-law, Emily's husband. But the feeling stayed. One Saturday night they sat around the table. Emily talked about a new case, her voice tired. John passed Jane a plate, his hand brushing hers. A jolt of heat shot through her. She pulled back, coughing to cover it. He grinned, asked, "You okay, Mom?" Jane nodded, but her eyes clung to his. When he rose to get wine, his shadow loomed on the wall, tall and strong. She looked away, scolding herself. After dinner, Emily slumped on the sofa, eyes heavy with sleep. John stayed in the kitchen with Jane, washing dishes. They stood close, his shoulder an arm's length from hers. "Emily works too much," he said, voice low. Jane nodded, glancing at him. He turned, his gaze locking with hers. Silence thickened the air. Her heartbeat pounded, fast and wild. He stepped closer, hand grazing the table's edge. Jane backed up, whispered, "Don't, John." He paused, nodded, but his eyes still burned. When they left, John hugged her. This time he held on, his breath warm against her hair. "Good night, Mom," he said, voice rough. Jane shut the door, hands trembling. She went upstairs, sat before the mirror. Her face was still striking, but her eyes swirled with chaos. She knew she shouldn't think of him, couldn't, but his image, his smile, his gaze, his warmth, clung to her like a shadow. That night, Jane couldn't sleep. She stood on the balcony, cold wind cutting through. She recalled his touch in the kitchen, his look when he spoke of Emily. She wondered if he felt it too, or if she was lost alone. The thought scared her, yet stirred her. She returned to bed, closed her eyes, tried to forget. But John lingered, sharp and dangerous in her mind. Jane lay in bed, eyes wide in the dark. John's last hug from the night before clung to her, his warmth, the woody scent of his cologne, his gaze when he said good night. She told herself to forget, that he was her son-in-law, Emily's husband. But her heart wouldn't listen, pounding every time she thought of him. The night dragged on, restless, that feeling like a smoldering flame. The next morning, the doorbell rang. Jane opened it to find John and Emily standing there. Emily smiled, holding a bag of pastries. "I want you to have breakfast with us, Mom." John stood behind her, his green eyes flicking over Jane, subtle but piercing. Jane nodded, let them in, keeping her voice steady. In the kitchen, Emily chatted about work, her tone lively. Jane listened, but her eyes drifted to John. He sat across from her, coffee in hand, fingers tapping the table lightly. When he passed the salt, their hands brushed. A jolt of heat shot through her. She pulled back. He smiled faintly, said, "Careful, Mom." His voice was low, laced with something more. After breakfast, Emily sank into the sofa, eyes heavy with exhaustion. She hugged a pillow, head tilting, then fell asleep, her breathing soft and even. Jane watched her daughter, a pang in her chest. John stood up, said, "I'll clean up with you, Mom." They moved to the kitchen, Jane washing dishes, John drying, standing close. His shoulder was a hand's width from hers. She felt his breath, warm and steady. Emily's always busy, he said, setting a plate down. Jane nodded, glancing at him. She's like her father, never stops. He gave a faint smile, but his eyes weren't happy. Jane turned back, scrubbing a dish, trying not to think of him, but he stepped closer right behind her. His warmth hit her neck, hot and clear. I'm lonely, you know that, Mom? He whispered. Jane froze, her hands stilled. She turned, his face inches from hers. His eyes locked onto hers, deep green and dangerous. Don't say that, John, she said, voice trembling. But he didn't back off. His hand touched hers, light but firm. His skin was warm, sending her pulse racing. The kitchen grew heavy, only the clock ticking and Emily's soft breaths from the sofa breaking the silence. Jane wanted to push him away, but his gaze held her. He leaned in, slow. His lips met hers, soft and hot. A surge of heat flared inside her, burning her reason. She kissed back, brief, then shoved him away. No, she gasped, stepping back. John stared, eyes still ablaze. I'm sorry, he said, but his tone held no regret. Jane turned, gripping the table's edge. She heard his breathing, heavy and fast. We can't, she repeated, to herself as much as him. He nodded, moved to the kitchen's far side. But his last look said he wouldn't stop. Jane stood there, hands shaking, mind in chaos. That kiss was wrong, but it was strong, pulling her deeper. She glanced at the sofa, saw Emily still asleep, head slumped on the pillow, oblivious. A car's sound from afar startled her. John turned, said, I'll grab something Emily asked for. He stepped outside, leaving her alone in the kitchen. She scrubbed the dish again, trying to erase his lips' feel. But every time she closed her eyes, he was there, his gaze, his breath. That afternoon, John returned alone, a bag in hand. Emily had a sudden meeting, he said, voice casual. Jane nodded, silent. He set the bag down, stood in the kitchen, a few steps away. About this morning, he started. Jane cut him off. Don't. But he closed in, eyes fixed on her. I don't regret it, he said, voice rough. Jane backed up, her back hitting the wall. He stopped in front of her, hands bracing the wall, trapping her. His breath brushed her face, warm and quick. John, no, she whispered, but it was weak. He leaned down, his lips near hers. She heard her heartbeat, the clock, the wind outside. Then he kissed her, deep and fierce. She resisted for a second, then gave in. Her hands grabbed his shirt, pulling him closer. The kiss stretched, searing, a fire no one could quench. A car sounded in the distance. They broke apart, breathless. Emily walked in, smiling. Meeting ended early. Jane turned, pretending to wash her hands. John greeted Emily, voice calm. But when he glanced at Jane, his eyes said it. This wasn't over. Jane stood in her kitchen, hands trembling as she washed them. John's second kiss, just moments ago, deep, fierce, irresistible, still burned within her. Emily walked in, smiling brightly, oblivious. John greeted his wife, voice steady, but his eyes slid to Jane, hot and sharp. She turned away, pretending to be busy, her mind a storm. She knew it was wrong, but she couldn't erase him. That Saturday night, they gathered at Jane's house. Emily, worn out from a long week, had sunken eyes. She ate little, spoke less, then stood. I'm going to bed. Jane nodded, watching her daughter climb the stairs, steps slow. John stayed behind, saying, I'll clean up with you, Mom. She wanted to refuse, but the words wouldn't come. They stood side by side in Jane's kitchen, her washing dishes, him drying. The space felt warm, the ceiling light dim. The sound of water drowned out her racing heartbeat. Emily's asleep, he said, voice low. Jane nodded, avoiding his gaze. She felt him draw closer, his breath brushing her shoulder. You're beautiful, you know that, Mom? He whispered. Jane froze, her hands stilled. She turned, his face inches from hers. His green eyes blazed with desire. Don't, John, she said, voice faint. He didn't retreat, his hand touching hers, warm and firm. The clock ticked, counting down. Jane wanted to flee, but her feet wouldn't move. He leaned in, his lips meeting hers. The kiss was deep, searing. She pushed him, but her hands were weak. He pulled her close, hands gripping her waist. She gave in, her lips melting into his, heart pounding. He pressed her against Jane's oak kitchen table, lifting her onto it. She sat there, legs wrapping around him beyond control. His breath came fast, hot against her neck, like fire. His hands slid down her back, strong and swift. She moaned softly, stifling it, afraid Emily might hear from upstairs. He kissed her neck, lips soft yet intense. Their bodies merged, trembling in silence. She felt him, full and warm, filling a void inside her. Time stopped, leaving only their ragged breaths and thumping hearts. They peaked together, bodies tensing, then easing. Jane panted, hands clutching his shoulders. He looked at her, eyes clouded with pleasure. They parted, quickly fixing their clothes. Jane wiped the table, hands shaking. John picked up a dropped dish, set it back on the shelf. Footsteps echoed from the stairs. Emily appeared at the kitchen door, yawning. "I'm thirsty." Jane turned, pretending to wash her hands. John handed Emily a glass of water, voice casual. "Go back to sleep." Emily nodded, drank, and trudged upstairs. Jane stood there, heart still racing. John looked at her, eyes laced with guilt but also thrill. "I'm sorry," he said. But it didn't sound true. She didn't reply, turning away. He stepped outside, leaving her alone in her kitchen. She stared at the wooden table, where it had happened, her chest heavy. It was wrong, but that feeling intense, forbidden, made her tremble. That night, Jane couldn't sleep. She lay in her bedroom, eyes wide. Her body still remembered John's warmth, his hands, his lips. She cursed herself, wondering how she let it happen in her own home. He was her son-in-law, someone she couldn't touch. But she couldn't forget. The way he pulled her, the way he made her dissolve. She heard Emily's steady breathing from the guest room, where she slept tonight, and her heart ached. She'd betrayed her daughter, yet couldn't stop wanting him. The next morning, John and Emily sat in Jane's kitchen for breakfast. Emily smiled, suspecting nothing. John sat across from Jane, his eyes flicking to her, subtle but sharp. She avoided them, focusing on her coffee. When he passed the bread, their hands brushed. A spark shot through her. She pulled back. He smiled faintly, as if nothing happened. But Jane knew they both recalled what took place on her kitchen table. She stood, pretending to get water, trying to erase it, but it clung to her, vivid and dangerous. Jane stood in her kitchen, clutching a cold glass of water, trying to drown the memory of last night on the oak table. But it clung to her, sharp and unrelenting. Just hours ago, in this very kitchen at her house, John had pinned her against the table, his hands firm on her waist, his breath hot and uneven against her skin as their bodies quaked in hushed surrender. It wasn't the first time he'd set her alight. Months back, when he'd hugged her goodbye after a weekend visit, his arms had lingered, his warmth bleeding through her sweater, stirring her pulse in a way she tried to dismiss. Then, weeks later, he'd kissed her for the first time in this same kitchen, a stolen moment while Emily slept on the sofa, his lips pressing against hers with a heat that shattered her restraint. That kiss had sparked others, each one pulling her deeper, until last night's reckless abandon in her kitchen had broken every boundary. This morning, Emily sat at Jane's breakfast table, laughing brightly, unaware of the chaos beneath the calm. John sat across from her, his green eyes catching hers, quiet but piercing. When he passed the bread, their fingers brushed. A jolt of fire raced through her, forcing her to jerk back as if stung. She bowed her head, guilt pressing down like a stone. She knew she'd betrayed Emily, but John, his smile, his gaze, his touch, held her in a grip she couldn't shake. The next day, Jane sealed herself in her house. She locked the door, pulled the curtains tight, shutting out the world, desperate to escape John, to escape herself. She wandered to her kitchen, her hand grazing the oak table where last night had unfolded, where he'd lifted her onto it. His lips tracing a burning path down her neck, his hands bold and urgent on her skin. Her fingers slid over the cool wood, but her mind replayed every second. His fierce eyes, his steady hold, the heat of his breath as he'd murmured her name. She told herself it had to end, that he was Emily's husband, her son-in-law, a line she couldn't cross. But the pull, dark, forbidden, a blaze roaring back to life, refused to release her. The phone rang, snapping her from her thoughts. Emily's voice bubbled through. "Mom, come over this afternoon? John's cooking, and I want you to taste it." Jane wanted to refuse, to confess she couldn't face him, but Emily's joy was too pure, too disarming. She forced a nod, her voice rough. "All right, I'll come." That afternoon, Jane stepped into Emily and John's house, a short walk from her own. The modern home glowed with light pouring through wide glass doors, a cruel contrast to the shadows in her heart. Emily greeted her with a wide smile. "I've got to run to the office for some files, Mom. Stay with John." "Okay?" Jane nodded, her pulse hammering. Emily left, the door clicking shut, leaving Jane alone with John in their living room. He stood tall, his shirt hugging his broad frame, his green eyes locking onto her with a force that made her breath catch. "Sit down, Mom," he said, his voice low and warm, edged with something dangerous. She sank onto the sofa, hands clasped tight, fighting to keep distance, to hold on to reason. John vanished into the kitchen, returned with a glass of water. He sat beside her, too close, his shoulder brushing hers. His warmth seeped into her, the faint woody scent of his cologne flooding her senses, dragging her back to that first hug when he'd held her at her door, the unexpected heat of it sparking something she couldn't name. To that first kiss in her kitchen, when he'd leaned in as Emily slept nearby, igniting a fire that refused to die, and to last night, when he'd claimed her on her own table, their bodies merging in desperate silence. "About last night," he started, his voice husky, his gaze pinning her. Jane cut him off, her voice sharp with fear. "Don't say it." But he leaned closer, his breath brushing her cheek, hot and unsteady. "I can't forget it," he murmured, the words thick with need. Jane pressed back against the sofa, trapped, her breath hitching. He moved in, his hand grazing hers, warm and firm, a touch that felt like it could bind her forever. "John, no," she whispered, tears spilling over, her resolve fraying as she spoke. He didn't pull back. His hand tugged her close, his lips crashing onto hers, deep and blazing, a fire breaking free. She shoved at his chest, fists pounding, but her strength dissolved, swallowed by his pull. He eased her down onto the sofa, his body settling over hers, heavy and warm, a barrier against the reality she longed to flee. His hands roamed her back, bold and unyielding, tearing down every wall she'd tried to build. She gave in, fingers digging into his shirt, pulling him nearer, her heart slamming against her ribs. His breath quickened, scorching her neck, sending tremors through her. He kissed her throat, lips soft yet wild, his tongue tracing searing lines across her skin. She moaned, a low, ragged cry, a release of hunger pent up for years, finally breaking free. Her body, untouched for 5 years since her husband's death, flared like a blaze too long smothered. She felt him, his hard lines, his living touch, like a torrent on the cracked, dry earth of her solitude. His hands tightened on her waist, possessive, pulling her flush against him as if to meld them into one. She hooked her legs around him, control slipping, desire drowning shame. He pressed into her, their bodies fusing, trembling in the quiet living room of Emily and John's house. She felt him fully, deeply, filling every hollow within, the loneliness, the emptiness, the yearning she'd buried for so long. Their breaths tangled, frantic and fiery, two desperate souls clashing in a storm. He gripped her harder, fingers knotting in her hair, tilting her head back to kiss her deeper, his tongue plunging into her mouth, wild and ravenous. She groaned louder, unrestrained, her body arching beneath him, teetering on the brink of shattering from the intensity. A car screeched to a halt outside, loud and abrupt, yanking them apart. They gasped, sweat streaming down their faces, their necks. Jane fumbled to fix her clothes, sitting up, hands trembling, eyes darting in panic. John stood, strode to the kitchen, grabbed a glass of water, his voice rough as Emily stepped inside. She carried files, grinning. "That was quick. I'm back early." Jane nodded, clutching the sofa, avoiding John's gaze, her heart torn to shreds. Emily sat down, chatting about work, her voice light as if the room hadn't just thrummed with tension. John set water before Jane, asking, "You okay, Mom?" She nodded, but his eyes, dark, smoldering heavy, betrayed his words. She stared down, guilt crushing her, yet the fire of want still burned, impossible to quench. That night, back in her own house, Jane lay in bed, eyes wide in the dark. Guilt clawed at her, choking her breath. She'd betrayed Emily again, this time in her daughter's home, on the sofa where Emily curled up with John to laugh and unwind. Emily's bright morning laugh echoed in her mind, a blade twisting in her chest. But her body wouldn't let go of John. His firm grip, his burning lips, the way he'd unleashed a hunger she'd starved for years. The clock ticked, each beat a judgment, marking her a traitor. She knew this had to stop, but she couldn't break free from him, from the abyss she'd tumbled into. The next morning, John arrived at Jane's house alone. He knocked, his voice low. "Emily's on a work trip today." She opened the door, longing to push him away, to scream that he had to leave, that the guilt was suffocating her. But her feet stayed planted, her eyes caught in his, green and ravenous. He stepped inside, standing in her kitchen, the same space where last night's passion had erupted. "I love you, Mom," he said, voice raw, his hand cupping her face, gentle yet firm, fingers brushing her cheek with a trembling warmth. Jane froze, her heart hammering, tears streaming down. "Don't say that," she choked out, voice breaking, but he closed the gap. "I can't stop," he rasped, his eyes ablaze, pulling her against him. She stumbled back, her back hitting the cold kitchen wall. He leaned in, kissing her, deep and ferocious, as if to swallow her whole. She kissed back, clutching his shirt, tears falling but her lips fused to his. They collapsed onto the sofa in her living room, his hands seizing her waist, fierce and wild, as if to claim her forever. His breath scorched her, blending with hers, a storm of gasps. He tugged her shirt up, hands roaming her skin, hot and rough, tracing every curve. She moaned, a long guttural cry, the sound of a woman starved, now freed after years of want. Their bodies fused again, trembling, forceful, two lost souls grasping for each other in the dark. She felt him, full and warm, filling every emptiness within, like rain soaking the dry, cracked earth of her lonely years. He thrust harder, hands gripping her hips, his breath in her ear, whispering her name, Jane, rough and pleading. The phone rang, slicing through like a blade. Jane shoved him off, panting, hands shaking, tears flowing. She answered, Emily's voice bright. "You okay, Mom?" "I couldn't reach John." Jane's voice cracked. "I'm fine, he's here." Emily laughed. "Good. I'll be home tonight." Jane hung up, staring at John. He stood, eyes blazing with desire, sweat glistening on his brow, his neck. "We have to stop," she whispered, voice frail, tears falling, her heart fracturing. He nodded, but didn't move, his gaze unwavering. They stood in her kitchen, a few steps apart, silent. But his eyes, deep, fiery, insatiable, spoke volumes. This wasn't over. And Jane, torn apart by guilt yet helpless against her longing, knew she didn't want it to be. Jane stood in her kitchen, a few steps from John, the air thick with tension after Emily's phone call interrupted their moment. He had just kissed her on the living room sofa, fierce and urgent, like the times before. His eyes stayed on her, sharp and wanting, but she turned away, gripping the edge of the oak table, the same table where they'd crossed the line one night. She remembered his first hug when he said goodbye, a brief warmth that unsettled her. Then that night Emily dozed off on the sofa. He kissed her right here in the kitchen, a sudden kiss that caught her off guard. Later, on this table, it was silent but intense, and just hours ago, they'd been close again, first at Emily's house, then back here. But when Emily's clear voice came through the phone, "Mom, you okay?" Everything inside her collapsed. "We have to stop," she said, voice hoarse, eyes on the floor. John nodded but didn't leave, his hand resting on the table, fingers tapping lightly. She turned her back, leaning against the wall, her chest heavy as stone. Emily's morning laugh, carefree and bright, flashed in her mind. She'd betrayed her daughter, not just once, but over and over in this kitchen, at Emily's house. John stood there, the woody scent of his cologne drifting over, stirring memories of his touch, moments when she lost all reason. She loved Emily, but she couldn't break free from him, couldn't shake the feeling he brought after years alone. That night, Jane sat in her living room, the dim light falling on the sofa where he'd pulled her down hours earlier. She clutched a pillow, eyes stinging, her mind a mess. She thought of David, her husband, gone 5 years now, leaving her with an emptiness she thought she'd mastered. But John had changed that. He woke something in her, a woman desperate to be touched, to feel again. She wondered how she could go on, facing Emily daily, knowing what she'd done behind her back. If this didn't end, Emily would find out, and her daughter's little family would shatter because of her. The next morning, Jane pulled a suitcase from the closet, hands shaking but resolute. She couldn't stay, couldn't face John or Emily anymore. She sat down, wrote a letter, her handwriting jagged. "Emily, I'm sorry. I need to go away for a while. Live well with John, that's all I want. Love, Mom." She didn't write the truth, didn't have the courage. She left the letter on the kitchen table, next to the oak table, where it all started, where she couldn't resist him. Jane dragged the suitcase to the door, the morning wind cold against her skin. She glanced back at the house, once her home with David, now stained with memories of John. She walked through the alley, the heavy suitcase scraping the ground, tears blurring her eyes, but her heart felt lighter. She didn't know where she'd go, only that she had to leave, to let Emily and John move on without her, the one who'd ruined everything. A bus rumbled up. She boarded it, didn't look back, just heard the engine roar as it took her away. John came to Jane's house that afternoon, knocked, got no answer. He pushed the door open, found the place empty, the suitcase gone. On the kitchen table, the letter sat, Jane's shaky handwriting stark against the paper. He read it, hands clenching the sheet, eyes red. He knew she left because of him, because of what they'd done, that first hug, the kiss in the kitchen, the night on the table, the times after. He sat down, touched the table, recalled her breath, her gaze on him. It hurt, but it also eased him. She was gone, and he knew he had to let go. That evening, Emily returned to their home, found John in the kitchen, eyes blank. "What's wrong?" she asked, worried. He handed her the letter, voice rough. "Your mom's gone." Emily read it, tears falling. Why didn't she tell me? She hugged John, unaware of the truth, unaware of how far he and her mother had gone. John held her, his chest tight. He said nothing, just gripped Emily harder, trying to push Jane from his mind. Jane sat on the bus, watching the scenery slide by, her heart empty but calm. She left because she loved Emily, to keep her happy. She couldn't erase John, his touch, those moments they couldn't resist, but she chose to protect her daughter. She thought, wrong love can be beautiful, but it costs the happiness of those we care about. That was the lesson she carried, though it still hurt to think of him. John kept the letter, tucked it in a drawer, didn't throw it away. Emily never asked more, but sometimes she noticed him drift. He didn't tell the truth, never would. He lived on with Emily, trying to forget Jane, but whenever he thought back, He saw her in the kitchen, on the sofa, close to him like she'd never left. It ended quietly, but no one truly forgot. The story of Jane and John leaves a profound lesson about forbidden love and its cost. Love, no matter how intense or beautiful, can turn into a blade when it defies morals and hurts those we cherish most. Jane, in her loneliness, let John fill her void, from that first hug, the unexpected kiss, to the moments they crossed the line. But each step cut deeper into her bond with Emily. She realized that, no matter how much she craved him, her daughter's happiness mattered more. Jane's choice to leave didn't erase her pain or memories of John, but it shielded Emily from a cruel truth. The lesson here is clear. Love isn't always free. Sometimes it demands sacrifice, letting go, to preserve something greater: family and duty. Jane and John's mistake reminds us that the price of blind passion is often the suffering of the innocent. It's a warning to weigh our desires against the harm they might bring. A call to choose wisely even when the heart pulls hard the other way. If you've followed the story this far, let me know where you're from. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Jane, John, and Emily's journey. How do you feel about Jane's decision or John's silence? Is forbidden love worth the risk? I'm here, ready to share more, listen to your story, or just chat. Drop me a message. I'm eager to connect, no matter where you are in the world. Tell me what you think, what you've been through, or anything at all. I'm waiting to hear from you, wherever you're tuning in from.